Tonight, we uncover the origins of names whispered in fear, names spoken only in exorcisms, footnotes, and forbidden margins. Names the Church knows well, but rarely explains. These are not random labels for evil, not medieval inventions, and not born from folklore. They come from ancient languages, erased texts, and beliefs older than Christianity itself. Some were once angels, others cosmic powers, some never meant to be demons at all. Yet over time, their identities were reshaped, reclassified, and buried beneath doctrine. The Vatican did not invent these names, but it inherited them, preserved them, and decided how they would be remembered. Their true origins trace back to forgotten scriptures, suppressed traditions, and a world where the line between divine and demonic was not yet fixed. So before you settle into comfort, understand this. Words have power, names carry history, and some truths were never meant to be spoken aloud. If you are ready to hear them, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. There is a book so old, so mysterious, and so disruptive that for centuries it was buried, banned, and barely whispered about. Not because it was false, but because it might have revealed too much. Its name is the Book of Enoch, and although most people have never read a single word of it, this ancient text may hold clues about the origins of angels, the fall of the Watchers, and the secret history of humankind. But what makes it even more shocking is that the Vatican knows exactly what it is, where it came from, and why it was never allowed to fully rise into the light. Before, it was pushed into the margins of religious history. Enoch was once a sacred voice among the Jewish apocalyptic writings. It wasn't some fringe document. It was quoted. It was respected. And for a time, it was even considered scripture by early Christians. The book is attributed to Enoch, a man mentioned in the book of Genesis who lived before the great flood, the great-grandfather of Noah, and the only human said to have walked with God and vanished without dying. But what makes one Enoch extraordinary is not just who it's about, but what it dares to reveal. The book describes visions of heaven, the structure of the cosmos, and the origin of demons. It speaks of fallen angels who took human wives, corrupted the earth, and taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. It even contains a prophecy of judgment that some believe directly points to the coming of the Messiah. Yet, despite all this, it was removed, erased, forgotten by most branches of Judaism and Christianity. Why would a text so full of divine insight be rejected so completely? The answer may not lie in the message itself, but in the fear of what that message could awaken. Most biblical scholars agree that the Book of Enoch was written in stages over several centuries, beginning around the 3rd century before Christ, during the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. That means it was already ancient by the time Jesus walked the earth. The book is not a single scroll, but a collection of writings grouped into sections, like the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, and the Astronomical Book. It was originally written in Aramaic, possibly also in early Hebrew, and then translated into Greek. But when those languages fell out of religious use, the book nearly vanished. What saved it was one surprising fact. The Ethiopian church had preserved it. In the land of ancient Axum, where Christianity took root very early, the Book of Enoch remained part of the biblical canon. It was copied, read, and protected in the Ge'ez language, even as it was forgotten in Europe. For more than 1,000 years, the only complete version of Enoch survived in Ethiopia, while the Western world remained unaware. That was until the late 1700s, when a Scottish explorer named James Bruce brought 3 manuscripts back from Ethiopia. And just like that, the book re-entered European consciousness. But by then, the damage had been done. Enoch had been cut from canon, classified as apocryphal, and left in the shadows. Yet its survival tells a different story. This book was not destroyed. It was hidden. Not lost, but sealed. Not false, but too revealing. And now, as more researchers return to its pages, the real question is not where it came from, but who has always known what it says. The Bible mentions him only briefly. In the book of Genesis, chapter 5, verse 24, it says simply that Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him. No death, no grave, just a man who vanished into the unknown. But that single mysterious line sparked something far greater. Later, Jewish writers looked at that verse and asked the question no one dared to ask out loud. What happened to Enoch when he was taken? And from that question, a new image of Enoch began to emerge, not as just a holy man, but as the first human to be shown the secrets of heaven. In the centuries leading up to the time of Jesus, a wave of religious writings appeared. Known today as apocalyptic literature, these texts were written by Jews who were trying to understand suffering, divine justice, and the cosmic war between good and evil. They lived under foreign rule. They saw temples destroyed. And they needed a language of hope. That language was often symbolic, filled with visions and prophecies. And at the center of many of those visions was Enoch. In the Book of the Watchers, one of the oldest parts of 1 Enoch is chosen to ascend into the heavens and witness things no human had ever seen. He is shown the structure of the cosmos, the paths of the stars, the storehouses of the winds. And he is given a mission to deliver a warning from God to the angels who had rebelled. These fallen angels, known as the Watchers, had descended to earth, taken human wives, and fathered the Nephilim, a race of giants. They taught humans forbidden knowledge, including metalwork enchantments, astrology, and the secrets of the earth. Their actions corrupted the world. And it was Enoch, not Noah, who was first shown why the great flood would come. This expansion of Enoch's role did not come from nowhere. It was a direct response to the short line in Genesis. Because if God took Enoch, then there had to be a reason. And if Enoch was taken without death, then he must have been transformed into something more. Jewish mystics and apocalyptic writers filled that gap by turning Enoch into a kind of prophet, a messenger, a heavenly scribe. In some texts, like Segment Enoch, he is even transformed into an angelic being called Metatron, the highest of angels, seated next to the divine throne. Though this idea is later and found mostly in mystical writings, it shows just how far the legend grew. What began as a short verse became a foundation for entire volumes of hidden knowledge. These writings were not part of the official Hebrew Bible, but they circulated widely among Jewish groups, especially those in the Second Temple period. They were preserved, copied, and passed along until their teachings began to echo, even in early Christian texts. The simple idea that a man once walked with God and disappeared became one of the deepest mysteries in all of ancient religion. And what came next would not only shake the boundaries of Jewish belief, but would challenge the very limits of what could be revealed about heaven itself. Most people hear the words Book of Enoch and assume it was written by one person at one time like a normal book. But that is not true. What we call First Enoch is not a single work. It is a collection, a layered anthology written by many different authors over many generations and later combined into one continuous text. It is more accurate to call it a library than a book. A library of visions, prophecies, warnings, and hidden knowledge. And each part of that library reveals a different piece of the mystery. Scholars divide 1st Enoch into 5 main sections. The first is the Book of the Watchers, which tells the story of the fallen angels who descended to earth and corrupted humanity. Then there is the Book of Parables, also known as the Similitudes, which contains deep messianic prophecies and introduces a mysterious figure called the Son of Man. Next is the Astronomical Book, or Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, which gives a detailed map of the stars, the moon, the sun, and the calendar. Then comes the Book of Dream Visions, filled with symbolic history of Israel and visions of future judgment. Finally, there is the Epistle of Enoch, a series of letters and warnings to future generations about justice, wisdom, and the final judgment. These sections were not all written at the same time. The Book of the Watchers is believed to be the oldest likely composed in the 3rd century before Christ. The other parts were added over the next 200 years, during a time of major upheaval in Jewish history. The people faced invasions, temple destruction, exile, and later, the growing power of Rome. These writings helped them make sense of chaos, and they wrapped their messages in visions and encoded language that only the faithful would understand. The authors of these texts didn't claim to be inventing new teachings. They claimed to be preserving ancient wisdom revealed by Enoch before the flood. That is why the name Enoch is attached to all of it, even though he never wrote these books. His name gave authority to the message and linked it back to the earliest roots of humanity. This technique was common in ancient Jewish writings. It was called pseudepigraphy, where a text is written in the name of a legendary figure to carry more weight. And in this case, Enoch became the ideal voice because he was the man who walked with God and was taken without death. A man who had seen heaven and returned with knowledge forbidden to the rest of the world. So when someone says the Book of Enoch, they are really referring to a complex set of texts woven together to form one of the most mysterious and powerful works of ancient religious literature. A book that claims to come from before the flood, but was shaped across centuries. And behind every layer lies one purpose: to reveal what others chose to hide. The Book of Enoch did not appear in a vacuum. It was born in a specific time, a world filled with tension, collapse, and hope. That world was the Second Temple period of Jewish history, a stretch of time that began around 538 years before Christ and lasted until the destruction of the Temple in the year 70. In that window of time, Jewish society was being reshaped again and again by foreign empires, new ideas, and the desperate need to understand why God seemed silent. It was during this time that apocalyptic literature began to rise. These were not just books about the end of the world. They were visions written during crisis moments when people believed the old world was dying, and a hidden truth was about to be revealed. The word apocalypse actually means unveiling, and that is exactly what the Book of Enoch tried to do. The earliest layers of 1st Enoch were likely written sometime between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ. At that time, Judea had already been under the control of the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks. And with each new empire came a fresh wave of cultural pressure. Foreign gods, foreign languages, foreign rulers. For many Jews, especially the faithful ones, this was not just political oppression, it was spiritual confusion. How could a chosen people suffer so much while the wicked seemed to rule? Why had the divine promises not come true? The temple stood in Jerusalem, but the world around it looked nothing like the one their ancestors had known. That is where apocalyptic writings stepped in. They gave voice to the oppressed. They claimed that justice was real but hidden, that angels were watching, that secret forces were moving behind history, and that a great reckoning was coming soon. The Book of Enoch is one of the earliest and most complex examples of this genre. It combines warnings to the wicked with cosmic visions of heaven and detailed timelines of judgment. It tells the faithful that what they see is not the whole picture, that above the chaos there is a divine order, and at the heart of that order stands Enoch, the man who saw it all. This kind of literature did not come from the temple priests. It came from the fringes, from scribes, prophets, and mystics who believed that the truth had been buried by corrupt powers and that only divine revelation could expose it again. These writers were not just historians, they were visionaries, and their words were often dangerous because they challenged the systems of power. The Second Temple world that produced Enoch was not peaceful or simple. It was a boiling pot of fear and faith waiting for a breakthrough. And for many, the Book of Enoch was that breakthrough. A voice from before the flood rising again in a world desperate for answers. Not through tradition, but through revelation. Not through the temple, but through a scroll. The language of a text can tell us more than just what was written. It reveals who wrote it, when, and for whom. In the case of the Book of Enoch, scholars have long agreed that its oldest layers were first written not in English, not in Latin, and not even in Greek, but in Aramaic, and possibly in early Hebrew. This matters because it places the origin of the text deep inside the world of ancient Judaism long before Christianity and far from the European traditions that would later try to erase it. Aramaic was the everyday spoken language of many Jews during the Second Temple period, especially between the 5th and 2nd centuries before Christ. It was the same language likely spoken by Jesus centuries later. It had replaced Hebrew in many areas of daily life, while Hebrew remained the language of formal worship and scripture. So when a text like Enoch appears in Aramaic, it means it was written for the common people, not just the religious elite. This was not a scroll meant to sit on a shelf. It was a warning, a vision, a message meant to be heard and understood by those who felt forgotten by their world. The proof of these Aramaic roots came in the mid-20th century when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near Qumran. Among them were fragments of the Book of Enoch, written in Aramaic. These fragments match parts of the Book of the Watchers and other sections from 1st Enoch, confirming that the text existed in Aramaic long before the later translations into Greek and Ge'ez. Some scholars also believe that parts of Enoch were first composed in Hebrew, especially sections that show more poetic or scriptural structure. This suggests that different authors over time added layers using the language most appropriate for their message and their audience. In some cases, Hebrew was used to link Enoch's words back to the sacred traditions. Others, Aramaic, was used to reach the people directly. This dual language origin shows how important and how flexible the Enoch writings were. They moved between formal and informal worlds, between temple knowledge and public warning. Later, the text would be translated into Greek, which became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before Christ. But that translation came later, and it was partial. Much of the original power and structure is found only in the Aramaic and Hebrew layers. That is why the fragments found at Qumran were so important. They pushed the origin of the text back centuries earlier than many had assumed, and they proved that the story of Enoch was not a Christian invention or a medieval myth. It was rooted in the language of ancient Israel, shaped by scribes who believed that hidden knowledge had to be preserved, even if it meant writing it down in languages that empires could not control. In the year 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard the sound of pottery breaking. What he discovered was not treasure, but something far more powerful. Inside that cave and others nearby were scrolls sealed in jars untouched for nearly 2,000 years. Today we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls. And among those fragments was a set of texts that changed everything scholars thought they knew about the Book of Enoch. These scrolls proved without a doubt that the Enoch writings were ancient, not medieval, not made up centuries later, but written in the language of the time, long before the rise of Christianity. Hidden in the Qumran caves were over 10 copies of texts from what we now call First Enoch. They were written in Aramaic, the everyday language of many Jews during the Second Temple period. Some of the fragments belonged to the Book of the Watchers, the section that describes the fallen angels, the Watchers, and their judgment. Others matched parts of the astronomical book, the section that explains the movement of heavenly bodies and calendars. These pieces were dated by experts using paleography and radiocarbon testing. Most were written between the 3rd and 1st centuries before Christ. That means the Book of Enoch was already in circulation among Jewish communities at least 200 years before Jesus was born. This discovery proved something that until then had only been guessed, that the Enoch texts were not inventions of early Christians or Gnostics, but came directly from pre-Christian Jewish thought. And not only that, they were being copied and preserved by a real group who valued them. That group was likely the Essenes, a Jewish sect who had broken away from the temple authorities and settled near the Dead Sea. They built a small community at Qumran, where they lived, prayed, and carefully copied sacred texts. Their library included copies of books now found in the Bible, as well as writings that were not accepted into the later Jewish canon. Enoch was one of those texts. For the Essenes, the Book of Enoch was not fiction. It was prophecy. It revealed cosmic battles, angelic secrets, and divine warnings about corruption and judgment. It fit perfectly with their belief that the world was in crisis and that hidden knowledge was the key to survival. The Qumran fragments showed that Enoch was not a forgotten myth, but an active part of Jewish religious life. It circulated alongside books like Isaiah and Psalms, and it shaped the way people thought about angels, sin, time, and the future. When these fragments were made public in the second half of the 20th century, they forced historians and theologians to rethink the timeline. The Book of Enoch was no longer just an apocryphal curiosity. It was a real ancient voice from the Second Temple world. And it had been buried in the desert, not to be destroyed, but to be found again at the right time. After the Aramaic and Hebrew layers of the Book of Enoch were written and circulated during the Second Temple period, something important happened. The ancient Jewish world was pulled into a new language and a new culture. That language was Greek, and it changed everything. After the conquests of Alexander the Great, in the 4th century before Christ, Greek became the dominant language across the Eastern Mediterranean. Even Jewish communities in Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor began to speak and write in Greek. This was not just a shift in words. It was a shift in how texts moved and survived. For the Book of Enoch, the Greek translation became the bridge that carried it beyond the borders of ancient Israel. Without Greek, Enoch would likely have disappeared. But because of Greek, it reached new audiences and entered new religious debates. Scholars believe that the Greek version of 1st Enoch was created sometime between the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ. It was likely translated in parts and may have circulated as separate scrolls at first. Portions of this Greek Enoch have survived in quotations from early Christian authors and in later manuscript fragments. Though most of the Greek text is now lost, the pieces that remain show that the translation was careful and respected. The Greek version was not just a copy. It was a gateway. It allowed the teachings of Enoch to enter the Hellenistic world, where philosophy, mystery cults, and new religions were spreading fast. It gave access to readers who could not understand Aramaic and who had no connection to the original Jewish context. Some of the earliest church fathers quoted Enoch using the Greek version. Figures like Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, and Clement of Alexandria all made reference to Enochic themes. Even the author of the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament directly quotes a prophecy from 1st Enoch, showing that the Greek form was already known to early Christians. The survival of these references proved that Enoch was once part of the broader intellectual and religious conversation in the Greek-speaking world. But over time, the Greek copies became rare. As Christianity became more institutionalized, the Church began narrowing the boundaries of accepted scripture. Enoch did not make the cut. It was removed from canon in the West, though still quoted by some. What survived were scattered fragments preserved in quotations, commentaries, and damaged manuscripts. One of the most famous Greek fragments of Enoch is called Codex Panapolitanus, discovered in Egypt. It contains parts of the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables written in Greek. Though incomplete, it gives crucial evidence of how the text was transmitted. The importance of Greek Enoch cannot be overstated. It was the middle step between the ancient Semitic roots and the later Ethiopic preservation. It was the link that kept the book alive, even as its original languages faded. And it proved that the message of Enoch once travelled far beyond the desert caves into a world that was not yet ready to forget. There is a single line in the New Testament that keeps the Book of Enoch from being completely forgotten. It appears near the end of the Bible in a small letter called the Epistle of Jude. Most people skip over it without noticing. But that one verse is powerful. It proves that early Christians knew the Book of Enoch and saw value in its message. The verse is Jude chapter 1, verse 14. It says Enoch the seventh from Adam prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all." That is not just a random quote. It is taken almost word for word from 1st Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. And it is the only direct quote from a non-canonical book found in the entire New Testament. This tells us something major. The author of Jude was familiar with the Enoch writings. He read them, he respected them, and he considered them worth repeating to a Christian audience. At the time, this letter was written probably between 60 and 90 years after the time of Jesus. The early church had not yet finalized its list of official books. Writings like Jude, Revelation, and even some letters of Paul were still being debated. So quoting from a book like Enoch was not strange. It was part of the larger world of sacred texts many believers still read. The verse in Jude is important for another reason. It refers to Enoch as a prophet. That gives him a role beyond just being an ancestor of Noah. It places him in the tradition of those who received visions and spoke warnings from God. And that is exactly how Enoch is portrayed in the apocalyptic writings. A man who ascended into the heavens and returned with a message about divine judgment. This one verse shows that Enoch's reputation as a seer and messenger was already established by the 1st century. The author of Jude uses Enoch's words to warn against corrupt leaders and false teachers. It fits perfectly with the theme of the book, which is all about exposing hidden danger and staying faithful to the truth. Yet, even with this clear reference, the Book of Enoch never became part of the official Christian Bible in the West. Later, church leaders avoided it. They called it suspicious, too strange, or linked to heretical movements. But they could not erase the fact that it had been quoted. The door was never fully closed. That one line in Jude kept Enoch in the conversation. It gave scholars a reason to look back. It gave believers a reason to wonder. If a book not found in the Bible could still speak so clearly about prophecy and judgment, then maybe it deserved another look. And maybe its removal had more to do with control than with truth. The quote remains printed in every New Testament to this day, a silent clue that something important was left behind. The Book of Enoch did not vanish in one moment. It faded slowly from the spotlight. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was allowed to slip quietly into the margins. In the Jewish world, Enoch was once widely read. It was copied and studied, especially among groups like the Essenes. But after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, and the rise of Rabbinic Judaism, the book began to lose support. The rabbis who shaped post-temple Judaism did not include Enoch in their sacred list. They focused on texts that supported legal tradition law and identity. Enoch, with its visions of fallen angels, cosmic judgment, and heavenly secrets, did not fit their new direction. It was too wild, too speculative, and too apocalyptic. So it was left out. In the Christian world, Enoch had a more complex path. In the early centuries, many church fathers knew the book. Some even quoted it. But as Christianity became more institutional, especially after the 4th century, the church began setting boundaries. Councils debated which books belonged in the canon and which did not. The Book of Enoch was never officially included in the Western canon. The reasons were not just theological. They were also political. Enoch contained material about rebellious angels, divine punishment, and knowledge given to humans by supernatural beings. These stories raised questions that were hard to control. They sounded too much like the myths of other cultures, or too close to ideas later linked with heresy. And while the Bible was being shaped into a unified collection, the leaders of the church had to decide which texts would support their authority. Enoch was unpredictable. It spoke of ancient visions and coming judgments, but not in ways that could be easily explained or taught in simple doctrine. So it was pushed aside. In the Latin West, most copies of Enoch disappeared. Only fragments survived. These were found in quotations by early writers like Tertullian or Origen, who still valued its voice. But by the Middle Ages, very few people in Europe had access to the full book. It was no longer copied in monasteries. It was no longer read in churches. And over time it was almost completely lost. In contrast, the Eastern churches, especially in Ethiopia, preserved the book in full. They continued to include it in their canon. They continued to copy it and read it. This divide between East and West meant that while one part of the Christian world buried Enoch, the other kept it alive. In the West, the loss was gradual. The silence was not forced. It was simply allowed to grow until it became normal. And so a book once considered powerful enough to be quoted in Scripture was left behind, not erased, but neglected, not rejected with violence, but forgotten through choice. A quiet fading that tells us more about those in power than about the book itself. While the Book of Enoch was fading from memory in Europe, it was being carefully preserved in a land far from Rome and Jerusalem. That land was Ethiopia. In the highlands of East Africa, where Christianity took deep root early on, the Book of Enoch did not just survive. It was honored, it was copied, and it became part of the national religious identity. Ethiopia's Christian tradition is one of the oldest in the world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its origins to the 4th century, when King Ezana of Aksum converted to Christianity. But even before that, Jewish communities were already present in the region. This created a unique religious blend where ancient Hebrew ideas met early Christian belief. The language of liturgy in Ethiopia was, and still is, Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that became the scriptural tongue of the Ethiopian Church. And it is in Ge'ez that the only complete version of 1st Enoch still exists today. The text known as 1 Enoch was translated into Ge'ez from a Greek version sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries. This means the Ethiopians received the book during a period when it was already disappearing elsewhere. They not only kept it, they elevated it. In the Ethiopian canon, the Book of Enoch is accepted as scripture. It is read alongside Genesis, Exodus, the Gospels, and other sacred texts. That inclusion is not symbolic. It is real. It is liturgical. And it has kept the full 5 parts of Enoch alive for over 1,000 years. These parts include the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. They are all there in the Ethiopian manuscripts, complete, intact, revered. This preservation is not just religious, it is historical. Because of Ethiopia, the modern world knows what 1st Enoch looked like in full. Without those Ge'ez manuscripts, scholars would only have fragments from Greek quotations or broken scrolls from Qumran. Ethiopia gave the world a mirror to the ancient voice of Enoch. And the fact that this happened outside of Europe adds another layer. It reminds us that the history of sacred texts is not controlled by one culture or one church. Truth travels, and sometimes it finds its home in unexpected places. For centuries, the West saw Ethiopia as distant and mysterious. But behind its mountain monasteries and ancient churches was a library that held one of the most explosive texts of all time, not locked away, but preserved through faith. The story of Enoch did not vanish. It took a different road. And while Rome debated what belonged in the Bible, Ethiopian monks were still writing out the words of Enoch by hand, passing them on through generations. What the West lost, Ethiopia remembered. And that memory has now become the key to rediscovering what was almost erased. The survival of the Book of Enoch in Ethiopia is not just a matter of geography. It is also a matter of language. The path that took this ancient Jewish text from its Aramaic and Hebrew roots into the highlands of East Africa passed through a critical phase. That phase was Greek. Most scholars agree that the full Ethiopic version of 1 Enoch, now preserved in the Ge'ez language, was translated not directly from Aramaic, but from a Greek source. This translation likely took place between the 4th and 6th centuries, when Christianity had already reached Ethiopia, and when Greek was still a major language of scripture across the eastern Mediterranean. Greek played a crucial role in the spread of religious texts. It was the language of the Septuagint, the earliest translation of the Hebrew Bible. It was also the language in which many early Christian writings circulated, including letters, gospels, and apocalyptic texts. Enoch was no exception. Though much of the original Greek version has been lost, fragments have survived in quotations from early Christian writers and in partial manuscripts, such as the Codex Panapolitanus found in Egypt. These Greek witnesses confirm that the Book of Enoch had already moved beyond its Jewish origins and into the wider Hellenistic world. By the time it reached Ethiopia, the Greek form had already shaped how the text was read and understood. But what makes the Ge'ez version so important is that it preserved more of the book than any of the surviving Greek copies. While only fragments of Greek Enoch exist today, the Ge'ez manuscripts contain all 5 major sections. This suggests that the Greek source used for the Ethiopian translation was more complete than what survived elsewhere. The Ethiopic translators did not just copy words. They preserved structure, sections, and meaning with remarkable care. This makes the Ge'ez version not just a translation, but a window into an earlier Greek tradition, now mostly lost. Even today, scholars use the Ge'ez text as a base for reconstructing the original Enochic writings, comparing it to the Aramaic fragments from Qumran and the sparse Greek remains. This work of reconstruction is slow and technical, but essential. It helps modern researchers trace how ideas traveled through cultures, and how sacred knowledge was protected by translation. The move from Greek to Ge'ez also tells a deeper story. It shows that Ethiopia was not simply a receiver of Christian tradition. It was a preserver of something others had abandoned. Through that Greek bridge, the Book of Enoch crossed into a world where it would be copied by monks, read by priests, and remembered by the faithful for over 1,000 years. And even though the original Greek manuscript used for the translation is now lost, the words it carried are still alive in the chants and liturgies of the Ethiopian Church. From Greek to Ge'ez, the message endured. A fragile thread of survival that held together a text the rest of the world tried to forget. In the year 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned to Europe after spending more than a decade in North Africa and the Middle East. He claimed to have reached the source of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, a feat many doubted at the time. But what Bruce brought back with him was not just tales of adventure. Hidden in his luggage were 3 handwritten manuscripts written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. These manuscripts contained the full text of the Book of Enoch. Until that moment, most European scholars believed the Book of Enoch was lost forever. They had only tiny fragments in Greek and a few references in early Christian writings. But Bruce's discovery changed that. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the complete book was in European hands. What made this moment so significant was that it was completely unexpected. Bruce hadn't gone to Ethiopia looking for ancient texts. His journey was focused on geography and exploration. But during his time at the Ethiopian court, he gained access to religious centers where he encountered the manuscript. The Ethiopians did not treat the Book of Enoch as a hidden secret. It was part of their canon, read and preserved like any other scripture. Bruce recognized the importance of what he had found. He brought back 3 copies of the text and deposited one at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, one at the Royal Library in Paris, and kept one for himself. At first, many European scholars dismissed his claims. Some thought the manuscripts were forgeries, or that the Ethiopic version had no connection to the ancient Jewish writings. But over time, careful study proved that the text was genuine. It matched the themes and passages quoted in early church writings. More importantly, it included the exact verse quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. Scholars realized that this was indeed the long-lost book of Enoch, preserved through a different Christian tradition, far from Rome and Constantinople. The rediscovery triggered a wave of interest in apocalyptic literature. It forced scholars to rethink the boundaries of ancient Jewish and Christian thought. And it raised difficult questions. Why had this book been erased from Western canon? What did it say that made it dangerous or inconvenient? Bruce's return in 1773 did not just bring home a manuscript. It reopened a door that had been sealed for centuries. The Book of Enoch began to be translated into English and other European languages. Academic papers were written, theories formed, and suddenly a voice from before the flood was speaking again. What had been preserved in mountain monasteries now entered the halls of universities. And with that shift, the story of Enoch re-entered the Western imagination, not as a legend, but as a recovered text, a document that had survived exile by traveling through time, culture, and language. And it all came back because one man dared to go where no one else had looked. Not all copies of the Book of Enoch returned to Protestant Europe. One of the most important manuscripts ended up in the heart of Catholic power inside Rome itself. This version of the Ethiopic text would later be catalogued as Vatican Ethiopic 71, known today as the Roman Enoch. It is one of the oldest complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, and it quietly entered the Vatican Library centuries ago. While James Bruce brought copies of Enoch to England and France, at least one copy made its way into Roman hands around the same period. Some believe that this manuscript was obtained by missionaries or diplomats working in Ethiopia during the 17th or 18th century, when contact between the Ethiopian Church and Catholic envoys was still active. The manuscript is written in the Ge'ez language using traditional Ethiopian script on parchment. It contains all 5 sections of 1 Enoch, including the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. What makes this copy special is not just its content, but its preservation. While other manuscripts were used, lost, or damaged, the Roman Enoch was protected within one of the most secure archives in the world, the Vatican Library. The Vatican Library, also known as the Bibliotheca Apostolica. Vaticana has for centuries collected rare and ancient texts from all over the world. It is home to handwritten Bibles, early Christian writings, and even non-Christian works from classical antiquity. The inclusion of the Book of Enoch in this archive shows that the Church was not ignorant of its existence. In fact, they had it stored, catalogued, and guarded. The manuscript was given the number VAT, ZE71, and has been studied by a small number of scholars with permission over the years. This raises a major question. If the Catholic Church preserved this manuscript, why did it never reintroduce the Book of Enoch to the public canon? Why keep it locked away instead of acknowledging its importance? Some argue that the content of Enoch presented problems for official doctrine. Its stories of fallen angels, secret knowledge, and heavenly judgment did not fit easily within the theological structures formed by later councils. Others point to the book's strong apocalyptic warnings, which speak against corruption and divine punishment as being too disruptive for institutional religion. Whatever the reason, the Roman Enoch remained hidden in plain sight. Not destroyed, but shelved. Not banned, but buried under layers of bureaucracy and control. It is only in the last century that this manuscript has received more attention from researchers trying to understand the global transmission of sacred texts. The Roman Enoch stands as a symbol of how knowledge can be preserved without being shared. It proves that the Church knew about Enoch, had access to its full contents, and yet chose silence. And that silence is just as revealing as the words written inside the manuscript itself. For centuries, the Vatican Library has held one of the world's most valuable collections of ancient texts. But few people realize that among these sacred and historical volumes lies a full manuscript of the Book of Enoch, written in Ge'ez. Catalogued as Vatican Ethiopic 71, this document became one of the quiet foundations for Enoch scholarship in Europe. While Protestant scholars in England and Germany were beginning to explore the newly recovered Book of Enoch in the 19th century, the Vatican already had its own copy preserved deep within its archives. The Vatican Library, formerly known as the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, was established in the 15th century and has been a storehouse of global knowledge ever since. It holds everything from early Christian writings to Jewish mystical texts to Greek and Roman philosophy. Over time, it also became a refuge for rare manuscripts from Africa and the Middle East. The Roman Enoch manuscript arrived through one of many contact points between Catholic envoys and the Ethiopian Church, likely sometime in the 17th or 18th century. While the Church never promoted Enoch for public use, the manuscript was carefully catalogued and preserved. That quiet act of preservation played a significant role in modern Enoch studies. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scholars across Europe were racing to piece together the scattered fragments of the Enoch tradition, the Vatican Library quietly became a node of access. Researchers with permission were allowed to view the Roman manuscript, compare it to other versions, and build a fuller picture of the book's transmission across languages and centuries. This work happened slowly, and often behind closed doors, but it was real. The Vatican's copy provided a stable reference point. It helped confirm that the Ethiopic version preserved more material than the broken Greek fragments. It helped establish that the content matched the quotes found in early Christian writings. And it reminded scholars that the Catholic Church had not erased Enoch completely. It had instead placed it in a sealed room where only the few with credentials could read it. That access made a difference. Scholars like August Dillman and R.H. Charles, who were instrumental in bringing Enoch to the wider academic world, made use of the Vatican's resources either directly or through shared scholarship. And even though the Church never officially recognized Enoch as canonical, its library became part of the global effort to understand where the book came from and why it mattered. Today, the Vatican Library still holds that manuscript and allows limited scholarly access. It remains one of the few places where ancient voices long silenced by religious politics can still be heard in their original form. The Vatican did not speak loudly about Enoch, but it did not destroy him either. Instead, it held him in the shadows of marble halls, in a city built on memory and power. A place where forbidden texts could rest quietly until the world was ready to read them again. The Book of Enoch did not survive as one neat manuscript passed from one generation to the next. It survived as a puzzle, pieces scattered across time, languages, and continents. Today, scholars rely on fragments from Greek, Aramaic, and Ge'ez to rebuild the original form of the book and understand how it developed over centuries. Even the smallest surviving pieces carry value. Among the most important of these are the Greek fragments, which include quotations preserved by early Christian writers and damaged manuscripts like those discovered in Egypt. One of the rare Greek witnesses is known as the Codex Panopolitanus, a 5th or 6th century papyrus discovered in the city of Akhmim, in Upper Egypt. This codex preserves parts of the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables. Though incomplete and worn by time, it gave scholars their first glimpse into how Enoch was translated and circulated in Greek. Alongside this, other tiny Greek citations exist, hidden in the writings of church fathers like Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and George Syncellus. Each quote, even just a sentence or a phrase, provides clues. These Greek fragments are compared word by word against the more complete Ethiopic version. That version, preserved in Ge'ez, gives scholars the structure and overall content of the book. But, because translations always change meaning slightly, the Greek pieces offer a checkpoint. They let researchers see whether certain phrases existed in earlier forms or were added later by translators. The process of reconstruction is meticulous. It requires cross-checking passages across different languages. When Aramaic fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced in the 20th century, they added a third layer to this process. These fragments, especially from the Qumran caves, predate both the Greek and Ethiopic versions. That means they are closer to the source. When all three are aligned, Aramaic, Greek, and Ge'ez scholars get a triangulated view of how the Book of Enoch evolved. In this effort, even the Vatican has played a role. A lesser-known Greek fragment of Enoch, held in Vatican collections, has helped refine how certain key phrases were originally worded. These may seem like small academic details, but they have big consequences. For example, changes in wording can shift the tone of Enoch's prophecies, his portrayal of the fallen angels, or his warnings about the end times. Understanding what was added, removed, or mistranslated reveals not just how the book changed, but why. It tells us what different communities feared, what they hoped, and what they believed was worth preserving. Every version of Enoch carries the fingerprints of the people who copied it, and every fragment, no matter how damaged or small, adds one more piece to the mystery. The work of reconstruction is not about restoring one perfect version of the book. It is about tracing the path it took to survive. Through deserts, monasteries, libraries, and archives. From scroll to codex to manuscript. The story is not just in the words Enoch spoke. It is in the journey those words made to reach us. When people talk about secrets hidden in the Vatican, they often mix up two very different places. One is the Vatican Apostolic Library. The other is the Vatican Apostolic Archive. They are both located within Vatican City, and both hold priceless documents. But they serve very different purposes. Knowing the difference is essential, especially when studying something like the Book of Enoch. The Vatican Library is the place where manuscripts are preserved. This includes religious texts, scientific treatises, historical writings, and literary works from across centuries. The Roman Enoch manuscript is held here. It is part of the collection known as VAT, Ethiopic 71. This library was officially established in the 15th century, but it contains works far older than that. Its role is to preserve handwritten books and rare editions, often stored under controlled conditions and catalogued with exact reference numbers. Scholars from around the world can request access under strict conditions to study these items for academic purposes. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, on the other hand, is where the Church keeps its documentary records. This includes letters from popes, decrees from councils, communications between bishops and governments, and other forms of written correspondence that reflect the administrative and political side of the Church. Until the year 2019, it was called the Vatican's Secret Archive, which led to confusion. The word secret in this case meant private, not hidden. But the name caused so many misunderstandings that Pope Francis ordered it changed to Apostolic Archive to make its function clearer. If you are looking for a manuscript of the Book of Enoch, you will not find it in the archive. You will find it in the library. If you are searching for a letter written by a cardinal about whether or not the Church should suppress certain texts, then the archive is where that letter might be. The archive holds the decisions. The library holds the books. Both institutions are vital to understanding how the Church has handled sensitive material over the centuries. But they should never be confused. Mixing them up leads to wrong conclusions and makes the investigation messy. For example, some conspiracy theories claim that the Vatican Archive is hiding dozens of banned books. But those books would not be in the archive. They would be in the library if they were preserved at all. And the library has a long track record of allowing scholarly access, though heavily regulated. Separating these two spaces also helps clarify how the Book of Enoch has been treated. The manuscript in Ge'ez, held in the library, is a physical witness that the Church did not destroy the book. The archive might hold documents showing why it was excluded from canon or how it was discussed by theologians. Together, these places tell two sides of the same story. One preserves the voice. The other preserves the decision to silence it. Knowing which door to knock on makes all the difference. When people hear the phrase Vatican Secret Archives, they often imagine hidden vaults filled with forbidden books and lost gospels guarded behind locked doors. But the word secret in this case never meant hidden in the way modern movies or mystery novels suggest. It meant private. The Latin word secretum was used for centuries to describe something that belonged personally to someone in power, not because it was shameful, but because it was not public. The Vatican Secret Archive was originally just the Pope's own collection of official documents. It was his personal filing system, a place where letters, decrees, and decisions were stored for internal use. For most of history, secretum meant the same thing in royal courts across Europe. Kings had their secretaries who handled their secretum, or private matters. There was no mystery in the word. It was just part of how administration worked. The confusion began when modern languages changed the meaning of secret. In English, for example, the word took on darker tones over time. It came to mean hidden deliberately, often with the idea that someone was trying to cover something up. So when English speakers heard about the Vatican Secret Archives, they imagined a giant religious conspiracy. That idea only grew stronger with the rise of books and films that use the phrase as a plot device. But the Vatican itself has never claimed the archive was meant to be mysterious. In fact, the Church has always used the word in its older sense. Even so, the misunderstanding became so widespread that in the year 2019, Pope Francis changed the name. He officially renamed the Vatican Secret Archive as the Vatican Apostolic Archive. In the official announcement, the Pope made it clear that the word secretum had caused too much confusion. He explained that it was better to use a term that matched the modern understanding of the institution. Apostolic better reflects the archive's role in preserving documents related to the leadership of the Church going back centuries. This change was not about rewriting history. It was about correcting a public misperception. The archive itself remains a serious academic institution. It holds over 50 miles of shelving and millions of documents, some dating back to the 8th century. Researchers can apply for access, and if approved, they can study letters from popes, edicts from councils, and even correspondence with emperors and kings. But it is not a library, and it is not where ancient banned texts are stored. Understanding the real meaning of secretum helps bring clarity to the larger discussion about texts like the Book of Enoch. If decisions about Enoch were ever documented, they would be in this archive, not because they were secret in the modern sense, but because they were part of the Pope's private administrative history. What has been called secret was actually just the Church's version of classified documents, not myth, not mystery, just a filing system from a time when Latin ruled the world of power. In the year 2019, Pope Francis made a decision that rewrote the way people around the world talk about the Vatican's most misunderstood institution. He changed the name of the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It was not just a cosmetic move. It was a deliberate attempt to fix a centuries-old misunderstanding. For years, the phrase secret archive had fed conspiracy theories, fueled documentaries, and filled the internet with speculation about forbidden texts and hidden history. But the original Latin word secretum never meant hidden or forbidden. It meant private. The archive was called secret because it belonged to the Pope, not because it was trying to hide something. Still, the modern meaning of the word secret had changed, and the Church knew it. The Vatican announced the name change in a document signed by Pope Francis himself, called a motu proprio, which is a type of official papal letter. In it he explained that the term secret had lost its original meaning in modern languages, and now suggested mystery or darkness. That misunderstanding, he said, was causing confusion, even though the archive had long been open to qualified scholars. By renaming it the Vatican Apostolic Archive, the Pope wanted to emphasize its connection to the history of the papacy and the apostolic tradition, not secrecy. The word apostolic highlights the archive's role in documenting the decisions and communications of popes across more than 1,200 years. It holds everything from letters written by emperors to reports from missionaries to official papal bulls. It is a working archive for serious historical research, not a vault for lost gospels or banned books. The name change also made headlines outside the Church. News outlets around the world covered the announcement with a mix of curiosity and relief. For decades, the phrase secret archive had created a sense of myth. Now the Pope himself had pulled back the curtain. He had not opened a new room or revealed a lost manuscript. He had simply told the world what was already true, that the name was misleading, and that the Church was ready to be clearer about its own past. Scholars welcomed the change because it brought the name in line with the actual function of the archive. It also helped reset the public narrative. The new name reminded people that this is not a fictional space from a Dan Brown novel. It is a historical institution with rules, procedures, and a mission. And for those studying texts like the Book of Enoch, this change matters. It reminds us to look carefully at what words mean and how those meanings evolve. The archive's purpose did not change in 2019, but the story around it did. Pope Francis did not erase the past, he clarified it. And in doing so, he helped future researchers navigate the boundary between myth and fact, between legend and document, between what is secret and what is simply private. Getting access to the Vatican Apostolic Archive is not like walking into a public library. It is a highly structured process designed for scholars who meet very specific criteria. And while that level of control has often fueled speculation about what the Vatican may be hiding, it is actually standard practice for most national and religious archives around the world. The first step in gaining access is submitting an application. This includes proof of academic credentials, a detailed explanation of the research project, and often a letter of recommendation from a recognized university or institution. The Vatican requires that researchers hold at least a doctoral level degree, or be working toward one in a relevant field, like history theology or archival studies. Once approved, scholars receive a research card that allows them to enter the archive reading rooms. But even with that access, there are strict limits. Researchers must request documents in advance and are only allowed to view a certain number of items per day. Digital copies are rarely permitted, and photography is strictly prohibited. All work must be done by hand, through written notes. These rules are not unique to the Vatican. Archives across Europe and the world have similar restrictions in place to protect fragile documents from damage or theft. The difference is that the Vatican Archive holds documents that span more than 1,200 years of church history. That includes correspondence from popes, interactions with monarchs, and reports from missionaries and church officials. Because of the sensitivity and age of the materials, the rules are especially strict. Another important detail is the rolling date restriction. Until recently, the Vatican only allowed access to materials up to the end of the pontificate of Pope Leo XIII, who died in 1903. But in 2020, under Pope Francis, that cutoff was extended to include materials up to the end of Pope Pius XII's reign, which ended in 1958. This move was seen as a major shift toward transparency and allowed scholars to explore church documents related to World War II for the first time. Still, many documents remain sealed due to their age condition or content. For some, that adds to the mystery. People assume that if something is restricted, it must be explosive. But most of the time it is simply a matter of preservation or privacy, involving people still living or policies still relevant. When it comes to the Book of Enoch, researchers would not look in the archive for the text itself, but rather for letters, memos, or council records discussing the book's place in church history. Those records, if they exist, would fall under the same access rules as everything else. Scholarly access is possible, but it is earned, not given freely. The process is not meant to hide truth, but to protect it from misuse and decay. It may not satisfy the curious tourist, but for those who come prepared, it opens a window into how the Church has shaped and stored its knowledge across centuries. The Book of Enoch is one of the most talked about ancient texts that never made it into the Catholic Bible. Its ideas echo through Christian history and even appear quoted in the New Testament, yet it remains outside the official canon. The reason for this is not simple censorship, but a long process of selection shaped by theology, authority, and tradition. When the early church was forming its Bible, it had to decide which books truly carried the weight of divine inspiration. This process took centuries. In the 4th and 5th centuries, church leaders held councils to confirm which texts belonged in Scripture. They relied on several criteria. The books had to be old, used in liturgy, connected to apostolic teaching, and in line with accepted doctrine. Enoch failed this test. It was known, but it was not widely used across the early church. By the time the canon was being finalized, the Book of Enoch was already fading from view in most Christian communities. Even though the Epistle of Jude quotes from it directly, the Church didn't see this as enough reason to include the whole book. Many early Christian leaders respected Enoch, but hesitated to call it Scripture. Some, like Tertullian, defended it, arguing that it was written by the ancient patriarch Enoch himself, the man who walked with God. But others were skeptical. They were concerned about the book's strange visions, its detailed stories of fallen angels, and its bold claims about heavenly secrets. Over time, those concerns grew stronger, especially as church doctrine became more structured. The Book of Enoch's descriptions of angelic rebellion and cosmic judgment did not fit easily into the system the church was building. It sounded too much like other apocalyptic and mystical texts that were being pushed aside. Another problem was that the book was preserved mostly in the East, especially in the Ethiopian church. In the Latin-speaking West, it vanished almost completely. Without widespread copies, the Western Church had little chance to include it, even if it wanted to. And once the canon was officially recognized by the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the list was closed. The Book of Enoch was not part of that list. That decision has never been reversed. Today, Catholic scholars do study Enoch. They acknowledge its influence on Jewish thought, early Christianity, and even parts of the New Testament. But they do not treat it as divine scripture. It is seen as part of the broader world of ancient religious writing, valuable but not binding. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church remains the only major Christian tradition that includes Enoch in its canon. For Catholics, Enoch is a fascinating witness to early faith, but not a voice of final authority. That status may seem unfair, especially given its age and bold ideas. But canon is not just about age or originality. It is about what the Church chose to carry forward as the foundation of belief. In that decision, Enoch was left just outside the gate. In the heart of East Africa, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church stands alone in one remarkable way. It is the only major Christian tradition in the world that includes the Book of Enoch in its official biblical canon. This fact makes Ethiopia not just a place where Enoch survived, but a central guardian of its authority. While the book disappeared from most of the Christian world, it remained in regular use among Ethiopian clergy monks and scribes. The reasons for this unique position are rooted in history, geography, and tradition. Christianity came to Ethiopia very early. According to tradition, it was brought by a man named Frumentius in the 4th century during the reign of King Ezana of Aksum. The Ethiopian Church developed independently from the Roman and Byzantine traditions, which allowed it to preserve texts and practices that were later lost or rejected elsewhere. When Ethiopian Christians compiled their canon, they did not limit themselves to the books used in the West. Instead, they included a broader range of texts, including Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, and most famously, the Book of Enoch. In the Ge'ez language, it is known as Enoch, and has been copied, studied, and honored for centuries. The Ethiopian biblical canon contains more books than the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox canons. It reflects a wider vision of Scripture shaped by ancient Jewish traditions and the local cultural context. Enoch fit perfectly into this world. Its stories of angels' judgment and heavenly mysteries resonated with the Ethiopian understanding of divine authority and spiritual warfare. Monasteries in Ethiopia preserved the book with great care. Scribes copied it by hand on parchment bound in leather and decorated with traditional artwork. These manuscripts weren't treated as curiosities. They were used in prayer, liturgy, and study. The book's teachings about the Watchers, the fate of sinners, and the secrets of the cosmos were considered vital parts of God's revelation. This reverence helped the Book of Enoch survive through centuries when it was forgotten elsewhere. Even when European missionaries came to Ethiopia in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were surprised to find the book in full use. To them, it was a lost relic. To Ethiopians, it was living scripture. That continuity is not just historical, it still exists today. In the modern Ethiopian Church, the Book of Enoch remains part of the Old Testament canon. It is read alongside Genesis, Exodus, and the prophets. It shapes sermons, teachings, and religious imagination. This status gives Ethiopia a unique role in Christian history. Without its preservation, the world might never have regained access to Enoch's visions. When scholars in Europe rediscovered the book in the 18th century, through James Bruce, it was Ethiopia they had to thank. The country did not just save a manuscript, it kept alive an entire worldview, one in which heaven speaks through angels, the fallen are judged, and Enoch walks with God, not just in legend, but in Scripture. When people talk about the secret origins of the Book of Enoch, they often imagine something hidden on purpose, something buried in a vault, or kept from the public by design. But the real story of these so-called secret origins is more complex and more historical. The secrecy is not about conspiracy. It is about survival. The Book of Enoch was written over time by different authors in different places using different languages. It is not a single book from one hand, but a layered collection of texts shaped by centuries of thought. Some parts, like the Book of the Watchers, were likely written in the 3rd century before Christ. Other parts, like the parables, may have been added as late as the 1st century. Originally written in Aramaic and possibly Hebrew, the earliest versions were passed down in fragments. These early forms were copied and shared within apocalyptic circles, especially in the Jewish communities around the Second Temple period. Then they moved into Greek, where sections were translated and adapted. But much of this material was lost in the West. By the time the Christian canon was being formalized, most churches had already lost access to the full text. The only place where Enoch survived completely was Ethiopia, where it was translated into Ge'ez and preserved as part of the biblical canon. So the origins became secret, not because they were erased, but because they were scattered. The pieces were there, but they were in different languages, stored in different places, and known to different traditions. This made it incredibly difficult for scholars to reconstruct the full story. For centuries, only partial fragments were available to European researchers. The discovery of the Ethiopic manuscripts in the 18th century changed that. But even then, the work was slow. Translating from Ge'ez required rare skills. Cross-checking with the limited Greek and Aramaic fragments meant long hours in restricted archives or private collections. The Vatican, Library and the Vatican Apostolic Archive played roles here not as gatekeepers of forbidden knowledge, but as institutions holding rare documents under careful conditions. Their access policies, which required credentials and approvals, led some to believe they were hiding things. In truth, they were doing what most major archives do, protecting fragile material and allowing limited scholarly access. But this system also added to the air of mystery. It made the Book of Enoch feel locked away, even when it was simply hard to get to. The puzzle of Enoch's origins is real, and it is built from language shifts, translation errors, lost manuscripts, and academic gatekeeping. It is a story told in parchment ink and marginal notes. What people call secret is really a complicated trail of evidence, left across thousands of years and multiple civilizations. The book survived not because it was hidden, but because it was preserved in fragments. The challenge was never just to find the book. It was to understand how it was written, how it changed, and how it traveled from ancient Judea to modern Ethiopia to the vaults of Rome. The Book of Enoch is one of the only ancient texts with a confirmed paper trail that links the Dead Sea Scrolls to early Christianity to the highlands of Ethiopia. This trail is not based on guesswork. It is grounded in real fragments, real translations, and real manuscripts that have survived for over 2,000 years. It begins at Qumran, where Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century. These pieces of parchment date as far back as the 2nd century before Christ, and are among the oldest known copies of Enoch. They confirm that Jewish groups living near the Dead Sea considered Enoch important and possibly even sacred. These early Aramaic fragments include sections of the Book of the Watchers and the Astronomical Book, showing that the core content of Enoch was already well developed long before Christianity. From there, the text moved into Greek. As Hellenistic culture spread through the Middle East, Jewish writings were often translated into Greek to reach wider audiences. Fragments of Greek Enoch have been found in Egypt, including the Codex Panopolitanus discovered in Akhmim, which contains parts of the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables. This codex is dated to the 5th or 6th century and reflects a Christian environment where Enoch was still being copied, even if it was not included in the canon. Other Greek fragments survive in quotations from early church writers like Clement of Alexandria and George Syncellus, who treated the book with respect, but stopped short of giving it scriptural status. Then comes the most complete step in the trail, Ethiopia. At some point between the 4th and 6th centuries, the Book of Enoch was translated from Greek into Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. Scholars believe this translation was likely based on a Greek version that no longer survives in full. The Ge'ez Enoch includes 5 major sections and preserves more of the original material than any known Greek or Aramaic source. It became part of the official canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and was preserved in monasteries across the country for over 1,000 years. In the 18th century, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce brought 3 Guiers manuscripts of Enoch back to Europe after a journey to Ethiopia in 1773. One copy ended up in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, another in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, a third in the Vatican Library catalogued as Vat. Ethiopic 71. That single act reconnected European scholars with a book they had only heard about through rumours and ancient quotes. From the caves of Qumran to the papyrus in Egypt to the monasteries of Ethiopia to the archives of Rome, the Book of Enoch has travelled a path unlike any other ancient text. Its journey is not just about faith. It is about language transmission, geography, and preservation. The paper trail is real, and it tells a story of survival across centuries, continents, and cultures. The idea that the Vatican knows the secret origins of the Book of Enoch often sparks images of hidden chambers guarded by silence and shadows. But the truth is simpler and more powerful. The Vatican knows because it preserves. It preserves manuscripts, letters, translations, and fragments that form part of the historical evidence scholars use to study Enoch's long journey. The Vatican Library is not a vault of forbidden knowledge. It is a research institution with one of the most important collections of ancient texts in the world. Among these is the manuscript known as Vat. Ethiopic 71, a complete Ge'ez version of the Book of Enoch, brought to Europe by James Bruce in the 18th century. This manuscript is not hidden. It is catalogued, conserved, and made available to scholars who meet the standard requirements for access. The Vatican does not control what the Book of Enoch means. It simply holds one of the keys to understanding where it came from. The story of Enoch spans centuries and languages. Aramaic fragments found at Qumran Greek quotes copied by early Christian writers and full Ge'ez manuscripts preserved in Ethiopia all play a role. The Vatican holds pieces of this puzzle, and those pieces are used by academics to reconstruct the full picture. That is not secrecy. It is stewardship. It is important to remember that the Church did not destroy the Book of Enoch. It chose not to include it in the official canon for reasons rooted in theology and tradition. But copies were not burned or banned everywhere. In some cases, the Church protected what it chose not to preach. This preservation includes not just the text of Enoch, but the context around it. Vatican collections contain letters from missionaries, scholars, and diplomats who encountered the book in Ethiopia. These records help historians trace how knowledge of Enoch moved between cultures and continents. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, while not the source of the Enoch text itself, may contain documentation about how church authorities discussed or classified such writings over time. That kind of institutional memory is critical. It means that even if the Church once saw the Book of Enoch as marginal or problematic, it still kept the paper trail. And it is that trail which allows scholars today to ask better questions and build better answers. So when people say the Vatican knows the secret origins of Enoch, what they are really saying is that the Vatican holds the evidence. It has not always made that evidence easy to reach, but it has kept it from being lost. And that act of preservation is not passive. It is a form of knowledge. Knowing does not always mean declaring. Sometimes it means collecting, cataloguing, and conserving until the right questions come along. The Vatican knows because it kept the books when others forgot they existed. It preserved what history nearly erased. That is not a conspiracy. That is continuity.